June 6, 1944, 07:20 hours. Widerstandsnest 33, Gold Beach, La Rivière Sector. Lieutenant Hans-Ulrich Schmidt, a 28-year-old veteran of the Russian front, braced as another naval shell screamed overhead, impacting harmlessly 100 meters behind his position. His concrete casemate, part of the Atlantic Wall, was a masterpiece of German engineering. It was 3.5 meters thick, sunk into the bluff, and gave his 7.5-centimeter PaK-40 anti-tank gun a perfect pre-sighted field of fire over the beach obstacles below. He felt a grim professional confidence. He was a soldier of the 716th Infantry Division, and his gun crew was elite. In his mind, he pictured the Allied tanks he had studied in recognition manuals, the American M4 Sherman. His men had a grim joke about it, a nickname they'd learned from the Panzer Grenadiers. Ronson, after the popular lighter. It lights up the first time, every time. He thought of the letters from his brother, an engineer at the Henschel factory, who described the new Königstiger, a 70-ton colossus of sloped steel. The German mind built Predators, Steel Knights. The Allies, they believed, built tin cans. The naval bombardment reached a deafening crescendo, then suddenly stopped. A terrifying, unnatural silence fell, broken only by the churn of the sea and the distant drone of landing craft. "They are coming," his sergeant whispered. Schmidt put his binoculars to the firing slit. He saw the first wave of Higgins boats. He saw men struggling in the surf. This was the plan. This was the Feuereröffnung. He was ready, but then through the smoke and mist he saw something else, something impossible, something that was not in any recognition manual. It was a tank, but it was crawling through the surf, its turret high above a canvas wall. Moments later, another tank emerged, this one with what looked like a giant rotating drum of chains on its front. It was lurching forward deliberately into his minefield, and the ground in front of it was exploding. The laughter of the engineers in Berlin, the confident jokes about Ronsons, died in his throat, replaced by a cold, sudden, and illogical dread. For the Allies, the Atlantic Wall was the single greatest tactical problem of the 20th century. It was not a single wall, but a deep multi-layered defensive system designed to annihilate an invasion force precisely at its most vulnerable moment. On the beaches, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had fanatically reinforced it. The system began miles offshore with naval mines. It continued in the tidal flat with Rommel's asparagus, angled wooden poles topped with mines, Belgian gates and massive steel barricades, and hedgehogs, crossed steel rails, all designed to impale and destroy landing craft. The beach itself was a killing zone, saturated with teller mines. Above the high tide line, a massive seawall, often wired and booby-trapped, blocked any vehicular exit, and behind it all, nestled in the dunes and cliffs, was a chain of interlocking concrete bunkers, the Widerstandsnesten, housing machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank cannons like Lieutenant Schmidt's. Their fire was pre-sighted to cross in a deadly web, ensuring no man could cross the 300 yards of open sand. The Allied planners knew that infantry alone would be massacred. They needed armor, and they needed it immediately. But a standard tank was useless. It would be swamped in the surf, blown up by a mine, or stopped cold by the seawall. And even if it got past all that, its cannon was designed for tank-on-tank duels, not for destroying a 3-meter-thick concrete bunker. They didn't just need a tank. They needed a toolbox. This problem fell to one of the most brilliant and eccentric minds in the British Army, Major General Percy Hobart. A disgraced and forcibly retired armor pioneer, he was brought back by Winston Churchill, who recognized his abrasive, unconventional genius. Hobart was given command of the 79th Armored Division, and a simple secret brief: invent, build, and train crews for a new family of specialized armor that could solve every single problem the Atlantic Wall presented. The result was a menagerie of bizarre, terrifyingly effective machines known as Hobart's Funnies. For Sergeant Tom Hadley, a 22-year-old from Coventry, the war was about to become very loud. He was the driver of a Sherman Crab, a standard M4 tank modified with a large rotating hydraulic drum on its front, to which 43 heavy-duty steel chains were attached. His job was not to fight, but to drive in a straight, unwavering line, directly into a German minefield, while spinning that drum at 140 RPM. Each chain, or flail, would slam into the ground with enough force to detonate any mine in its path. He sat in the driver's seat of his LCT, the smell of diesel and the sea filling his compartment. He was terrified. He was completely blind. Once the flail started, the noise would be deafening. A catastrophic rhythmic roar that drowned out even artillery. His periscope would be instantly obscured by a blinding cloud of dust, smoke, and pulverized earth. He would be steering by compass and by the desperate, shouted corrections of his commander in the turret. His mission was to clear a 10-foot-wide path, the carpet, for the infantry and other tanks. If he veered, he would leave a mine for the man behind him. If his flail missed a mine, his own track would find it. If he stopped, he was a 30-ton stationary target for every POC-40 on the bluff. He was the tip of the spear, the canary in the coal mine, and the entire invasion of Gold Beach depended on him and a few dozen other flailers like him. Further back, in another LCT, the crew of a Churchill AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, checked their primary weapon. It was not a high-velocity cannon. It was a 290mm spigot mortar, nicknamed the Flying Dustbin. It was a weapon of pure, brutal demolition, designed to fire a 40-pound trash can-shaped charge filled with high explosives. Its range was pathetic, less than 100 yards. Its purpose was singular, to drive up to a concrete bunker, point blank, and blast it into rubble. They were not tankers in the traditional sense. They were combat engineers, demolition men inside a 40-ton fortress. In the design bureaus of Henschel and Porsche, German engineers operated with a sense of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. They were the creators of the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger and the Panzer V Panther. These were weapons of profound technological superiority, built around two principles: impenetrable sloped armor and a high-velocity gun, the 8.8cm KWK-36 and the 7.5cm KWK-42, that could kill Allied tanks from 2 kilometers away. This quality over quantity doctrine, a near fetish for engineering perfection, permeated the entire Wehrmacht. German tankers and engineers viewed the American M4 Sherman with open contempt. It was a mass-produced item, a product of crass commercialism, not warrior-like craftsmanship. They mocked its thin vertical armor, its underpowered 75mm gun, and its gasoline engine that had a terrifying tendency to ignite when hit. The Ronson nickname was not just a joke. It was a core tenet of their battlefield philosophy. They were knights in their steel castles. The Allies were peasants in their flammable tin cans. This arrogance defined their defensive strategy for the Atlantic Wall. The plan was simple, and based on their own weapons. The minefields would stop the infantry. The steel obstacles would stop the landing craft. The seawall would stop the tanks. And the POC-40s and pre-sighted 88s, guns designed to kill tigers, would methodically pick apart the handful of Shermans that, by some miracle, made it to the beach. The German plan was a rigid, perfect, and deeply arrogant calculation, and it had one fatal, catastrophic flaw. It assumed the Allies were just as stupid and unoriginal as German propaganda claimed. They had planned for a conventional attack. They had no plan for an alien invasion. 7.25 hours. Gold Beach. The moment Lieutenant Schmidt saw the swimming DD tanks, his plan began to unravel. His POC-40 crew, trained to fire on stationary targets on the road, now had to frantically traverse to hit wallowing, half-submerged targets in the surf. But the DD tanks were a distraction. The real nightmare was approaching the shore. Sergeant Tom Hadley's LCT ramp slammed down. "Driver, move out! Flail on!" Hadley engaged the hydraulic clutch. A roar filled his ears as the flail in front of him spun to life. He hit the beach at a crawl, his world vanishing into a cloud of sand. Boom! The first teller mine detonated, the concussion shaking the 30-ton tank. Boom! Boom! 2 more went up, shattering the flail chains, which was what they were designed to do. He kept moving. In his tiny periscope, he saw nothing but brown smoke. In his ears, he heard only the whump, whump, whump of the chains and the crack of explosions. From his bunker, Lieutenant Schmidt watched in utter disbelief. A tank was attacking his minefield. It was eating the mines, chewing a path through the sand with mechanical, terrifying indifference. The core of his defense was being breached in seconds. "Fire!" he screamed at his POC-40 crew. "Fire on that Teufels machine!" The 7.5cm gun cracked, the armor-piercing shell streaking across the beach. It hit the Crab. The tank shuddered, but its armor held, and it kept coming. Now another monster was moving. A Churchill tank, impervious to the MG-42 fire that was raking it, rumbled across the newly cleared lane. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It ignored the infantry. It ignored the other tanks. It drove directly towards WN-33. It was an AVRE. Fire! Schmidt screamed again. The PaK-40 fired. The shell hit the Churchill's thick frontal plate and ricocheted, sparking harmlessly into the sky. The AVRE lumbered to a halt 80 yards from Schmidt's bunker. Its comically short, fat mortar angled up. With a sound like a giant cough, thunk, the flying dustbin was launched. It tumbled through the air in a high, lazy arc and slammed into the concrete face of the casemate. The explosion was unlike anything Schmidt had ever experienced. The 40-pound charge, a Hesh, high-explosive squash head round, did not penetrate. It flattened. It spread its explosive energy over the surface, sending a shockwave of unimaginable force through the 3.5-meter thick concrete. The interior of the bunker became a shrapnel bomb of its own making. The back wall of the casemate scabbled, blowing inward in a shotgun blast of concrete fragments. Schmidt was thrown against the wall, his eardrums shattered. His PaK-40 was twisted wreckage. His crew was gone, vaporized in a red mist and pulverized concrete. The invincible fortress had been killed by a single horrifying dustbin. The assault on the British and Canadian beaches was a stunning, brutal success. The sequential attack of Hobart's Funnies worked exactly as planned. The DD tanks provided initial fire. The Crabs flailed paths through the mines. The AVREs shattered the concrete strongpoints. And for the most stubborn positions, the Churchill Crocodiles arrived. These tanks unleashed a 180-meter-long jet of liquid fire, incinerating German crews who refused to surrender. The German 7/16th Division, facing this mechanized terror, simply disintegrated. The path inland was open within hours. The most horrific and unexpected proof of the Funnies' success came from what happened where they were not used. Omaha Beach. The American command, particularly General Omar Bradley, had been skeptical of Hobart's bizarre contraptions. They found them too complex, too specialized, and too British. They rejected the offer of the 79th Armored Division, opting to rely on their own DD tanks, most of which sank in the rough seas, and conventional tank destroyers. The result was a catastrophe. On Omaha, the GIs of the 1st and 29th Divisions faced the exact same problems as the British: mines, seawalls, and concrete bunkers. But they had no Crabs to clear the mines. They had no AVREs to blast the bunkers. They had only their bodies, their rifles, and their bazookas. They were pinned down on the tidal flat, in the exact killing zone the Germans had planned, and were systematically slaughtered for hours. The laughter of the German engineers was validated on Omaha. But the horror of Hobart's Funnies and their absence turned Omaha into a charnel house. The American control group proved in blood that the Funnies were the single most important technological factor in the success of D-Day. The psychological shock to the German defenders on Gold, Juno, and Sword was total. Their entire worldview, built on German engineering superiority, was shattered in the first 30 minutes of the invasion. The Ronson was no longer a joke. It was now a mechanical hydra, a multi-headed beast that could swim, clear mines, and breathe fire. The laughter of the engineers was replaced by the screams of men being burned alive by the crocodile, a weapon so terrifying that its mere appearance would later cause entire SS garrisons to surrender. The arrogance of the panzer crews, who prided themselves on their long-range dueling prowess, was rendered irrelevant. The AVRE didn't want a duel. It wanted to drive up to your house, knock on the door, and detonate a 40-pound charge that turned your skeleton to dust. This was a new kind of war. It wasn't a war of quality versus quantity. It was a war of adaptability. The Germans had built a perfect key, the Tiger, for a lock that didn't exist, a long-range tank duel on the steppes. The Allies had built a whole ring of skeleton keys, ugly, specialized, and single-purpose, designed to pick the exact lock the Germans had built on the Atlantic Wall. The psychological effect was one of utter intellectual and mechanical defeat. The 79th Armoured Division, Percy Hobart's zoo, was the unsung hero of the Battle of Normandy. They saved tens of thousands of lives. They were kept together as a specialist unit and deployed at every major obstacle the Allies faced, from the crossing of the Seine to the breaching of the Siegfried Line. Their tools were so effective, so essential, that they became the blueprint for an entirely new class of vehicle: the Modern Combat Engineer Vehicle, CEV, and the Armored Vehicle Launched Bridge, AVLB. The legacy of Hobart's Funnies is that victory does not always go to the most expensive, powerful, or perfect weapon. It goes to the most adaptable one. The German engineers had laughed at the Sherman, but it was the Sherman's simple, reliable, and modifiable chassis that allowed it to become a crab flail, a DD tank, or a Zippo flamethrower. The Tiger's perfect design was a logistical and mechanical prison. It was too complex, too heavy, and too unreliable to be adapted into anything else. The Funnies were the ultimate expression of tactical problem-solving. They were ugly, they were strange, and they were horrifyingly effective. They proved that the laughter of an arrogant engineer is the most dangerous sound in war, for it is the sound of a mind that has already been defeated by its own hubris.